My husband laughed and said, I can always marry again while we sat across from each other at our anniversary dinner. 6 hours later, at 3 o'clock in the morning, he would walk into our penthouse and find my wedding ring resting alone on the floor. For the first time in years, he would realize something priceless was gone. My name is Evelyn Carter Hayes, and the night I walked away from my marriage began with a laugh. Not a cruel laugh. Cruelty would have been easier to understand. No, this was something far worse. Carelessness, the kind that comes from believing the person who loves you will never have the strength to leave. Outside, rain streamed down the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Tribeca penthouse. The lights of Manhattan blurred into shimmering streaks of gold against the dark glass. Below us, the city pulsed with life, busy, beautiful, and completely indifferent. Inside, everything looked perfect. Fresh white roses, ivory candles flickering softly across the table, crystal wine glasses, a bottle of Napa Valley red wine I remembered him admiring years ago, and even the chocolate cake from the little bakery in the West Village, where we had celebrated our second date. I had thought of everything, every detail. I had even spent extra time getting ready. A simple black dress, my favorite pearl earrings, my hair carefully styled, and concealer hiding the exhaustion beneath my eyes. I wanted tonight to matter. Apparently, I was the only one. Grant sat across from me wearing an expensive charcoal suit. His attention wasn't on me. It was fixed on the phone in his hand while he lazily swirled whiskey inside a crystal glass. Buy them out, he said into the phone. I don't care if Bennett gets emotional. Business isn't therapy. I waited quietly. Finally, I spoke. Grant. Without lifting his eyes from the screen, he raised one finger. Wait. That tiny gesture hurt more than any insult could have. 5 years of marriage. 10 years since we first met at a charity auction in Midtown Manhattan. Back then, he accidentally spilled champagne across my sketchbook. Embarrassed, he immediately offered to replace it. I smiled and told him he could start with an apology. He laughed. A genuine laugh. The kind that reached his eyes. The kind I hadn't heard in years. Someone on the other end of the call said something that made Grant smirk. Our marriage slipped from his lips as casually as discussing the weather. Careful, his friend joked, ignore your wife long enough and she might run away. Grant leaned back in his chair. He chuckled. Please, he said, I can always marry again. The room didn't erupt. Nothing shattered. The earth didn't tremble. There was no dramatic scene. His words simply drifted across the candlelit table and settled deep inside my heart. Heavy, final, permanent. In that single moment, I understood exactly what I had become to him. Replaceable. I slowly looked down at my wedding ring. The diamond sparkled in the candlelight. 5 years earlier, Grant had slipped it onto my finger inside a beautiful Connecticut church filled with white roses and the sound of violins. Back then, he had promised I would always be the only woman he would ever choose. Tonight, his laughter told a very different story. Grant never noticed the silence on the drive home. He was too busy answering emails, closing another deal, and winning another battle. To him, the anniversary dinner had been just another obligation squeezed between business meetings. He didn't see the tears. Evelyn quietly wiped away as she stared out the rain-covered window. When the car stopped outside their Tribeca penthouse, Grant glanced at his watch. I have to head back to the office, he said, already reaching for his phone. There are contracts waiting. Evelyn simply nodded. Of course. He didn't kiss her goodbye. He didn't notice the sadness in her eyes. Within seconds, the elevator doors closed, and he was gone. For several minutes, Evelyn stood alone in the silent apartment. The rain tapped softly against the massive windows. She slowly walked through every room. The living room where they once laughed together. The kitchen where they used to cook Sunday breakfasts. And the balcony where Grant had promised they would grow old together. Every memory felt like it belonged to strangers. She entered their bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out a single suitcase. Not every dress, Not every pair of shoes, only the things that truly belonged to her. Her sketchbooks, her mother's pearl necklace, and a faded photograph of her late father smiling beside a tiny Christmas tree. Everything else she left behind. Then she walked to the center of the living room. Her fingers gently touched the wedding ring that had rested on her hand for 5 years. The diamond caught the light one last time. With a slow, steady breath, she slipped it off. The tiny circle of gold landed softly on the polished marble floor. It made almost no sound, but somehow it echoed through the empty penthouse. Evelyn looked at it for one final moment. Goodbye, Grant. She picked up her suitcase, walked through the front door, and never looked back. 6 hours later, at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, Grant stepped into the dark apartment expecting another ordinary night. Instead, his eyes fell on something glittering in the moonlight. A single wedding ring was lying alone on the floor. For the first time in years, his heart skipped a beat. Grant froze. For several long seconds, he simply stared at the wedding ring lying on the marble floor. The apartment was unnaturally quiet. There was no music, no television, and no soft footsteps coming from the bedroom. Just silence. A silence that suddenly felt heavier than the walls around him. Evelyn, he called. There was no answer. He walked through the penthouse one room at a time. The bedroom was empty, and the closet door stood slightly open. Only then did he notice the empty space where her suitcase had been. His pulse quickened. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3, then voicemail. He frowned. Come on, Evelyn. He called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. For the first time in years, Grant felt something he couldn't negotiate. Panic. He opened the drawer beside the bed, hoping to find a note. There was nothing. No goodbye. No explanation. Just an empty space where her life had once been. Then he noticed something else. The white roses she had placed on the dining table that evening were still fresh, beautiful, and untouched. Beside them sat the chocolate cake from the little bakery where they had celebrated their second date. It was still unopened. Only then did he remember. She had planned everything. The candles, the wine, the dinner, their anniversary. And all he could remember saying was, I can always marry again. The words echoed in his mind. This time, they didn't sound funny. They sounded unforgivable. Grant slowly lowered himself into a chair. For years, he had believed Evelyn would always be there, always waiting, always forgiving, and always choosing him. Tonight, for the first time, he realized she had finally chosen herself. Deep inside, he felt the terrifying truth. He hadn't lost an argument. He had lost the woman who had loved him more than anyone else ever had. The next morning, Grant didn't go to the office. For the first time in over a decade, he canceled every meeting on his calendar. His assistant was stunned. So the Bennett acquisition closes at noon. I don't care, Grant replied. Cancel it. His voice was calm, but inside, panic was spreading. He drove across Manhattan searching for the places Evelyn loved. The little bakery in the West Village, her favorite art gallery in Soho, and the quiet cafe near Central Park where she used to sketch for hours. No one had seen her. By noon, he called her closest friends. Nothing. By evening, he was calling hospitals. Still nothing. Meanwhile, miles away, Evelyn stood on the balcony of a small apartment overlooking the Hudson River. It wasn't a luxury penthouse. There were no marble floors, no crystal chandeliers, and no expensive artwork. But for the first time in years, she could breathe. She unpacked only a few belongings. Her sketchbooks, her mother's pearl necklace, and a small wooden box containing letters she had written to herself over the years. Letters she had never been brave enough to read. She opened the newest one. The first line made tears fill her eyes. If you're reading this, it means you've finally found the courage to choose yourself. Evelyn smiled through her tears, not because she was happy, but because she was finally free. At that very moment, Grant stood alone inside their silent penthouse. His phone buzzed. Hope flashed across his face. It wasn't Evelyn. It was a notification from the bank. Joint account closed. For the first time, Grant understood. This wasn't a temporary fight. His wife hadn't left to teach him a lesson. She had left to start a life that no longer included him. Grant didn't sleep. Every room in the penthouse reminded him of Evelyn. Her favorite chair by the window, the coffee mug she always used on Sunday mornings, and the painting she had made during their first year of marriage. For years, he had walked past these things without noticing them. Now they were all he could see. Just after sunrise, his phone rang. It was his private investigator. "I found her." Grant stood so quickly his chair crashed onto the floor. "Where is she?" "She rented a small apartment on the west side of Manhattan." Grant grabbed his car keys without another word. An hour later, he stood outside the modest apartment building. It was nothing like the luxurious life they had shared. He couldn't understand why Evelyn would choose this place. As he reached the front door, he saw her. She stepped out carrying a portfolio of sketches, wearing a simple white blouse and jeans. There was no sadness on her face, only peace. For a moment, Grant forgot every speech he had rehearsed. "Evelyn." She stopped and slowly turned around. Their eyes met. "I made a mistake," Grant whispered. "I'm sorry." Evelyn looked at him quietly. "I know," she said. Those two words shattered him more than any scream ever could. "I've changed," he pleaded. "I'll do anything." She smiled gently. "The problem isn't that you changed too late, Grant. It's that I spent years begging you to notice me, and you never did." She took one step backward. "You only see my value now because you've finally experienced my absence." With that, she turned around and walked away. Grant stood frozen on the sidewalk. For the first time in his life, money couldn't fix the damage. Power couldn't erase his words. And love was no longer his to reclaim. Grant refused to accept that it was over. Every morning, he sent flowers to Evelyn's apartment. Every evening, he left heartfelt messages she never returned. He wrote long letters, apologizing for every anniversary he had forgotten, every promise he had broken, and every moment he had chosen business over the woman who loved him. But Evelyn never answered. Not because she hated him, because she had finally learned that peace begins with silence. Weeks passed. For the first time in years, Evelyn filled her days with something other than waiting for Grant. She returned to painting. The passion she had buried beneath years of loneliness slowly came back to life. One afternoon, she carried a portfolio of new artwork into a small gallery in Soho. She expected another polite rejection. Instead, the gallery owner stood speechless. "Did you paint these?" Evelyn nodded. He smiled. "I've been looking for an artist with this kind of honesty. I'd like to feature your work in our upcoming exhibition." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, not because someone had saved her, but because someone had finally seen her. Meanwhile, Grant sat alone in his glass office overlooking Manhattan. His company was thriving. Profits were climbing. Investors were celebrating. Yet none of it mattered anymore. His phone buzzed with a message from an old friend. Attached was a photograph from the gallery's social media page. There stood Evelyn, smiling beside her paintings, confident, radiant, alive. Grant stared at the image for a long time. Only then did he understand the truth. The woman he thought needed him had discovered she never did. And the life he believed would always wait for him was moving forward without him. The night of Evelyn's exhibition, the gallery was overflowing with collectors, journalists, art critics, and visitors. People stood quietly in front of her paintings, reading the small descriptions beneath each canvas. Every piece told the story of a woman who had slowly disappeared and then found herself again. One painting drew the largest crowd. It showed a lone wedding ring resting on a polished marble floor beneath a rain-soaked window. Its title was "The Night I Chose Myself." Visitors stood silently before it. Some wiped away tears. Others whispered that they had never seen heartbreak painted so honestly. Across the room, a distinguished gray-haired collector approached Evelyn. "I'd like to buy this painting," he said. "And not just this one?" He smiled warmly. "I want your entire collection." The offer was worth more than Evelyn had earned in the last 5 years. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she quietly accepted. At that same moment, Grant stepped into the gallery. He had come hoping for one more chance. Instead, he found strangers celebrating the woman he had failed to appreciate. He watched as reporters gathered around Evelyn. Cameras flashed. People congratulated her. She wasn't standing in anyone's shadow anymore. She had become the center of her own story. Grant started walking toward her but stopped halfway. He realized something painful. She wasn't looking for him. She wasn't waiting for him. She wasn't even thinking about him. For years, he had been the center of Evelyn's world. Now, he was just another face in the crowd. As applause filled the gallery, Grant quietly turned around and walked back toward the exit. For the first time, he understood that some doors don't slam shut. They close softly and never open again. 3 months later, Evelyn's life looked nothing like it had before. Her paintings had sold across New York magazines, called her one of the city's most promising new artists, and collectors waited months for her next exhibition. Success had arrived quietly, just as healing had. One crisp autumn morning, she received an invitation to speak at a charity gala in Manhattan. The event brought together business leaders, artists, and philanthropists from across the country. Evelyn almost declined. Then she noticed the venue. It was the very ballroom where she had first met Grant 10 years earlier. She smiled to herself. Life had a strange sense of timing. That evening, she walked into the ballroom wearing an elegant navy blue gown. Not to impress anyone, but simply because she finally felt confident in her own skin. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience rose to applaud. Grant sat frozen at one of the front tables. He hadn't known she would be the keynote speaker. Evelyn looked across the room. Their eyes met for only a brief moment. Then she began speaking. "There was a time when I believed my worth depended on whether someone chose me." The room fell silent. "I spent years trying to earn love that should have been freely given." She paused. "But the greatest day of my life wasn't the day I got married. It was the day I realized I could choose myself." Thunderous applause echoed through the ballroom. Grant lowered his head. Every word felt as though it had been written for him. When the event ended, he waited near the exit, hoping to speak with her one last time. Evelyn approached calmly. Grant's voice trembled. "I'm proud of you." She smiled kindly. "Thank you. I wish I had understood sooner." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked past him, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with peace. Grant remained standing alone, finally understanding that the greatest revenge had never been hurting him. It had been living a beautiful life without needing him at all. Winter arrived quietly. Snow drifted across the streets of Manhattan, covering the city in white. Nearly a year had passed since the night Evelyn walked away. Grant still lived in the same penthouse with the same floor-to-ceiling windows, the same marble floors, and the same silence. The wedding ring remained locked inside the drawer of his bedside table, not because he believed Evelyn would return, but because he couldn't bring himself to let it go. One snowy afternoon, Grant received an unexpected invitation. It was to Evelyn's newest art exhibition. He hesitated. Then he went. The gallery was larger this time. Every painting carried a story of hope, healing, and courage. At the center of the room stood Evelyn's final masterpiece, a woman walking toward a sunrise, leaving behind a dark city fading into the distance. Its title was Forward. People admired the painting. Some smiled. Others quietly wiped away tears. Grant stood in front of it for a long time. He finally understood. The painting wasn't about leaving a city. It was about leaving pain behind. As he turned to leave, he noticed Evelyn speaking with a young couple. They thanked her. "Your story gave us the courage to fight for our marriage before it was too late." Evelyn smiled warmly. never stopped choosing each other, she said. Love doesn't disappear in a single day. It fades one forgotten moment at a time. Grant closed his eyes. Those words stayed with him. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't ask for another chance. Some apologies come too late. Some lessons cost everything. Grant quietly walked out into the falling snow. Behind him, the gallery was filled with light. Ahead of him, the cold streets stretched into the distance. For the first time, he stopped chasing the past and finally accepted the future he had created with his own choices. 1 year later, spring returned to New York. The trees in Central Park were covered in fresh green leaves, and the city felt alive again. So did Evelyn. That morning, she unlocked the doors to her own art studio. Above the entrance hung a simple sign, Evelyn Carter Studio. Inside, young artists filled the room. Some had lost confidence, and some had given up on their dreams. Evelyn welcomed every one of them with the same gentle smile. She knew exactly what it felt like to believe you weren't enough. Now, she wanted others to discover their own strength. That afternoon, a black sedan stopped across the street. Grant stepped out. He didn't walk inside. He simply stood on the sidewalk, watching through the window. He saw Evelyn laughing with her students. He saw the peace on her face, the happiness she had searched for during their marriage. She had finally found without him. For a long moment, Grant smiled, not because he had won her back, but because he finally understood what love truly meant. Real love isn't about possession. It isn't about assuming someone will always stay. It's about choosing them every single day. Quietly, he placed a small envelope in the studio's mailbox. Inside was only one handwritten note. Thank you for loving me, even when I didn't deserve it. I'm sorry I realized your worth only after you were gone. I won't ask you to come back. I only hope your future is brighter than anything I could have given you, Grant. Evelyn found the letter that evening. She read it once, smiled softly, then folded it carefully and placed it inside a drawer. Not as a reminder of heartbreak, but as proof of how far she had come. She looked around her studio, at the students, the paintings, the life she had built with her own hands. Then she quietly whispered, I finally chose myself. Outside, the sun dipped below the Manhattan skyline. A new chapter had begun, not because someone rescued her, but because she discovered that the strongest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's becoming so happy that their absence no longer defines your future. The end. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional revenge stories, family dramas, and inspiring life lessons. See you in the next story.